This is a webinar that's being done on the operational indicators of forced labor, and we're doing it under the umbrella of the ILO's Global Business Network on forced labor. Just as a brief recap, as I think many of you have heard before, we're a global business network building a future without forced labor, bringing together companies of all sizes and sectors, as well as other business networks, work collectively on this issue. We're focused on driving action, scale, and sustainability through collaboration, and collaboration being the key word there for us, particularly in terms of the fact that we look to connect various actors from smaller enterprises to larger enterprises and make sure that everybody is part of this conversation going forward. We also look to convene different types of actors. So this refers to, for example, engaging with government bodies to ensure that we are able to raise key messages with them. We look for innovative solutions that are able to drive scale in various parts of the world, and also to focus on country-level engagement and interaction, particularly with employer and business membership organizations, sectoral associations at country level to drive locally owned and locally driven solutions. And fourthly, we're very much about providing support. And what this webinar very much for us falls into that category of being able to provide clear and actionable information to business to help them to understand further the topic of forced labor, as well as the solutions. Essentially, forced labor for us is very much grounded in the ILO's Convention 29, which was adopted in 1930. And this definition that you see on your screen there is all work or service that is exacted from any persons under the menace of penalty and for which that person has not offered him or herself voluntarily. So the indicators that you will see in a moment give life to this definition, but there are three important parts of this definition, which means that it pertains to all work or service. The definition also comes with two parts in the sense that the work must be undertaken involuntarily, but also under the threat or menace of penalty. So these are two key parts of this definition. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, at present, the ILO estimates that there are 25 million people in forced labor globally. Of that, there are 20.8 million working in the private economy. And we like to illustrate through the numbers on the screen there in terms of the region-wise that this is really a problem that is global. There's forced labor present in every region of the world. We do see, for example, the highest prevalence in Asia Pacific, but no country or no region is immune to the issue. The same for industry sectors. No industry is immune, but we also do see certain prevalence in different sectors, such as that of construction, manufacturing, as well as domestic work. At this point, I'll turn over to my colleague Luiz, who will take you through the operational indicators.
Hello, everyone. As mentioned as well, I'm going to talk about the ILO's 11 indicators. It's not a magic number. We just came up with these main indicators. Of course, sometimes they do subgroup into others. We'll talk about it later in the presentation. But these indicators, we call them operational indicators, okay? So they should provide the basis for a clear and common set of criteria to identify forced labor in practice. So the key word here is identified, no? For identification. So each indicator represents a measurable variable, okay? I'm sorry also if I don't look directly at the camera because I have to look at the screen so I don't miss any points. So the need for indicators, we have some questions here on these needs. First, what? So we want to translate international instruments and national legislation into concrete and operational indicators. How do we break down these legislation or these standards into subdivisions which will help us in this identification process? Why? So for detection, for the screening of potential victims, as mentioned, identification, protection, and then the prosecution. This helps at all levels since the filing of a complaint, by a potential victim and till the point of prosecution and conviction. So these indicators, they help in all these phases. And also to produce statistics, we do have some new resolutions from the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, the so-called ICLS. They worked in 2018 on a definition for statistical purposes of forced labor. So they do not use specifically these 11 indicators. They have developed their own methodology for statistics. So it's important to make it clear that they do not use the same indicators. So for whom these indicators that we're going to talk about are relevant. So police officers, labor inspectors, NGOs, trade unions, employers, social auditors, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyone who wants to really identify a situation of forced labor, where we usually use it at national, regional, local, and sector-based levels. Okay? And how do we do it? So based on experience, on practice, also with research and knowledge. So let's go to the indicators. This is the cover of the booklet we did publish and disseminate with the list of the indicators, which we'll now see. So how to use these indicators, usually to spot a sign or a yellow or even a red flag. For example, if you see in the workplace bars on windows, locked doors, fences, or even guarded entrances, exits, surveillance cameras, workers that sleep at the workplace, curfews and accompanied visits, these can, for example, indicate restriction of movement. So it raises automatically a red flag in this case. We also check for causes by investigating further. So it's very important that you look into the situation, because one indicator alone may not by itself characterize a situation of forced labor. You may have to gather a few of these indicators, but a few of them or a couple of them alone, they already do indicate forced labor. And I'll talk about this when we get to them. But we should go further by asking, is there a good explanation for this to be happening? And what are the reasons for this restriction? Also gather additional evidence. So conduct separate interviews from workers and employers. It's always good to not do it together. The workers, they may feel under pressure or not comfortable to speak openly. Also inspect working areas, sleeping areas, and surroundings. So go beyond the workplace. Look for other signs that could reinforce the presence of an indicator, and also consider off the clock or surprise inspections. Okay, so this is an example of how to use the indicators related to restriction of movements. So the list of indicators are these. So abuse of vulnerability, deception, restriction of movements, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, retention of identity documents, withholding of wages, debt bondage, abusive living and working conditions, and excessive overtime. So beginning with abuse of vulnerability. So it's very important to mention that anyone can be a victim of forced labor and trafficking. We've had several cases. I mean, it's more common to see poor people or those who are in a more poor situation instead of the richer. But we do have cases of rich people being deceived into trafficking and forced labor. But certain characteristics make people more vulnerable. For example, people with disabilities, physical or mental, the age, so children and minors, they are automatically more vulnerable. those who do not have a residence or in the case of a migrant worker, a legal status in the country, or the work permit is tied to the employer, for example, the kafala system in the Middle East, or irregular work status, poverty or lack of education, as I mentioned before, and even migrant workers with different nationality status. So this list, of course, is just a sample, but it shows us how these factors can increase vulnerability, and also situations of multiple dependency. For example, if you depend on housing, on the food, on jobs for family members as well, it may put you into higher risk. And we should also ask, does the employer take advantage of the worker's vulnerabilities or any of these vulnerabilities? And did the employer or recruiter create or contribute to the employer's situation of vulnerability? So the employer should not manipulate the worker or create a situation to take advantage of this vulnerability. So the second one would be deception. So it's often related to recruitments in the recruitment phase. So example, false promises regarding the wages, the housing and living conditions, the nature of the job location, the legal status. So it's very common that workers are promised one thing, and then when they get to the workplace, it's a totally different reality. Some signs we need to be attend to are the so-called substitution contracts. So when the worker arrives, there is a new contract. Even contracts in another language, making it difficult to understand the terms for the worker, and no employment contracts, even just a verbal contract, which makes it difficult for the worker to prove what were the conditions agreed. And possible questions that one can ask is, how did the worker learn about this job? What was the worker promised? And is the worker vulnerable to deception? So based on the previous slides, we can look at that list. And if he or she had known the real conditions, would he or she have accepted the job? Okay, so this is the category for deception, and we do have next restriction of movement. We did mention already a few elements here, but it's also important to say it can occur during the recruitment phase while being transported at the workplace. So it can be during the first phase of the trafficking, and also at the exploitation phase. Workers can have movements controlled by obvious means. For example, we mentioned locked doors, surveillance cameras, or guards. But their movements can also be controlled by less obvious ways. So workers might only be permitted to leave the work site if accompanied by an agent of or the employer. So this is to control the worker, and curfew might be imposed, or the absence of a worker's duration from the workplace might be always monitored. And it's always much easier to control the workers' movement if they sleep in the premises. So we should also look into why are the workers sleeping at the same place they're working. So moving on, we have isolation. So I'm including here three cases or three examples of isolation, so it becomes a bit clearer for us. A migrant worker who doesn't speak the local language is not allowed to talk or write to anyone, even his parents. Even if the person did speak the language, still, if the person is not allowed to contact anyone, to use communication tools or equipment, we consider this person to be in isolation. Also, a worker who performs the work and lives at a textile factory and his or her mobile is confiscated. So again, it's making it difficult for the person to reach anyone else outside the workplace. And then a person who works in a farm in a remote location that isn't accessible, or the worker doesn't even know where he or she is, and even how to get out of that situation or that place, or even to reach the nearest town. So there are images here of some workplaces where workers were found in forced labor situations. So one of strong indicators we have is physical and sexual violence. So it's easier to identify the physical violence because there are visible injuries or untreated injuries. A bit more difficult in the case of sexual violence, but there are signs we can look at. For example, when the worker shows anxiety or fear, employers that show aggression towards the workers. So we have to be always looking into these different signs. Sometimes they're very subtle, but they can represent a situation where we have to look into more carefully. Just an image of a worker who was physically abused. This is an iron to mark the cattle. So the worker was marked several times with hot iron. And then we have intimidation and threats. So as you remember from the definition from Convention 29, forced labor is any work or service exacted by a person where he did not present himself voluntarily and under any kind of threat. So we must evaluate from the worker's perspective these threats, and we can include abuse directed at other workers as well. I mean, when other workers are threatened, it can be used to serve an example to the whole group, for example. So some quotes we got from interviews with workers are, "You'll be deported," or "The police will arrest you if you leave the house or the workplace," or "You are worthless and stupid," and so on. So these cases of threats, they many times are used to restrict or to trap the worker into forced labor. And then retention of identity documents, it's also a very common means of control, especially with migrant workers. So many workers feel they cannot leave the workplace without risking the loss of their identity documents, such as their passports. And without such documentation, they may feel helpless and unable to get other jobs or access services, or maybe even too afraid to ask authorities for help, especially if the migrant workers are in an irregular situation in the country they're working. And then we have withholding of wages. And the key question here is, are these wages purposely withheld so that the worker cannot freely terminate the employment or change employer? So other signs that we can look into are, does the employer have a record of payments or wage records, and have these been altered in any way? Also, are wages paid to a third party or to an account controlled by the employer? How are these wages paid to the worker? Is the worker paid less than a minimum wage or less than the agreed? Is there a large percentage of wages paid in kind, which shouldn't? Workers are paid regularly and payments are delayed constantly. And also if workers are subjected to excessive or illegal wage deductions. Okay, so there is even a very common term used at the ILO and United States, which is wage theft, which can lead also into our next indicator, which is debt bondage. So one of the most common forms of forced labor. which is the work that is used as a means of repaying a debt. So when the value of the service offered are not properly assessed, without clear limit or duration and nature. So an illegal debt is created so that you can trap the worker into that working relationship, into forced labor. And the terms of repayment are not clear or even inexistent. And excessive recruitment and transportation costs are charged to the worker. So we can also refer to the ILO's general principles and operational guidelines for fair recruitment and the definition of recruitment fees and related costs. These were adopted, the definitions were adopted in 2018, so quite recent. But these recruitment fees and transportation costs, many times they're used to inflate a debt so that the worker can never pay it off. Food and accommodation are charged also at inflated prices. And many times in national contexts, foods and accommodation, they should be provided by the employer. So not even charged at, by the employer. So extremely high interest rates as well. So a manipulation of this debt. And debt amounts are manipulated or falsified, as I did already mention. So it's very common to see employers that keep records of these debts owed by workers. So there are several cases where we found notebooks or pieces of paper with the debt of each individual worker. Moving on, we have abusive living and working conditions. So the key question here is, has the worker been coerced into remaining in a situation that other workers or another person will not endure? So for example, I see no best way of presenting this than by using pictures. So I'll go through some cases, and please look at these images that I did include here. So for example, hazardous work is one key element of abusive working conditions. Also inadequate protective gear and training. Inadequate sanitation facilities, this both for the working and the living conditions. And this image here is of an actual, in quotes, toilet. I took this picture when I followed an inspection raid. Poor lighting and poor ventilation. We see it a lot in sweatshops. Also the lack of heat, especially in winter time. The lack of running and drinking water, adequate food, etc. So the image on the left, you can see some fish drying because there's no way to keep the food, to store the food properly. There's no fridge in this case. And on the right, you can see the water that the workers were drinking in this situation, and even bathing. You see there's a soap right next to it. And it is very common to see animals, cattle, horses drinking the same water. Also overcrowding, limited or no privacy, sorry. We do see many living or lodging conditions of extreme overcrowd, 20, 15 people sleeping in the same room, in the same space, and also gender mix, or children together with adults. So there are all sorts of problems with this, including drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and sexual violence. And lastly, excessive overtime. So excessive overtime doesn't mean that long hours would amount to forced labor. Of course, in excess of national legislation. We have always have to be careful to look into the national and legal context. But excessive overtime also means the work that the worker has to endure during the times that he or she is actually executing the job. So they should always prompt for further investigation. We should look for following signs. So is the work piece rates for paid per piece and bound to unrealistic production targets, pushing the workers always to work more and more and to work long hours? Is overtime needed to reach a minimum wage? Is working hours loosely defined, if at all? Or a person who works on the call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? This doesn't mean, again, it is a forced labor situation, but it can raise a flag, a yellow flag, for example. Also, if breaks are denied, even days off and free time. We have seen cases of workers who worked 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, overtime beyond national law and collective agreements, and also penalty if overtime is refused, for example, blacklisting workers. So we come almost to the end, but before we finish, there is a short video we would like you to watch.
And just to say, not to worry if you don't hear sound. It's just an illustrative video. There's no sound that accompanies it.
So just to update the figure at the end, the new estimate is that we have 25 million people in forced labor, not 21 anymore. I think we do have a list of reference material, but you can find them. We'll share these slides, and you can also find them in the Business Network website. Yes, a very comprehensive list of tools and other material on forced labor. Yeah, here they are. Do you want to mention anything more on this slide?
Just to say that we will share all the slides with you. These are hyperlinks here that you'll be able to access. We will also, and earlier on in the slides, you will have seen the link to the guidelines on fair recruitment, as well as the definition on recruitment costs and fees. At this point, we'll stop for question and answers. So thank you very much, Luis, for the comprehensive overview. Please feel free to either use the chat function to contact us, or to use the question and answer. You can also, of course, if you would like to raise your hand using that function, we'll be able to enable you to speak to us directly. So please go ahead. I will stop the slideshow for the moment just to be able to better control the controls of the meeting. Okay, not too many questions coming in, but maybe we to share a question that we had earlier from colleague was back to this point a little bit around the fact that often national legislation has varying guidance on forced labor, and increasingly there are a number of different laws coming into play and what the role of business should be in terms of taking action. I think from the ILO perspective, we always encourage business to first and foremostly look at the the context in which they're working, to look at national law and what this refers to, as well as, of course, to look at international guidance and to see how you could, for example, ensure that you are adhering to international labor standards with regards to forced labor in particular. So they are, through the materials that we will share the links to, you'll see a couple of key actions that business can take and that you can share with those that you work with, for example. Increasingly, of course, additional guidance coming out on recruitment, which is an important topic, given that particularly under the ILO's protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, there was a recognition of the fact that the number of migrant workers who face situations of forced labor is high, and they do face additional vulnerabilities. So this is an important aspect for us to take into account. So if there are any other questions, we'll hang on to the line for a couple more minutes for you to engage, or as we mentioned, we will share the recording as well as the slides for you to take a look at the information in more detail.
Come closer.
Okay, no questions. Everybody is very silent today, understandably so, many of you joining early in your morning. So thank you to all who have joined and for taking the time to be with us today. We will share a follow-up email with you as soon as possible. And please feel free to reach out to us. The Business Network's website is flbusiness.network, and there you will find contact details where you can reach us directly should you have follow-up questions. But thank you again to everybody for joining the call.
Thank you very much. And from our Brazilian participants, obrigado.